Good evening, everyone. It's so nice to have you on our call. I hope that you've gotten all your kids ready for bed, those of you on the East Coast, and have some time to sit and to learn and to think about discipline this evening. I'm going to be on the webcam every once in a while, and then other times I'm going to flip to just my screen. So I hope that that this helps to show you that there's a real person here. Welcome to Trauma Sensitive Discipline. I am Allison Douglas. I'm a trainer and coordinator at Harmony Family Center here in Knoxville, Tennessee. But more important, I think, than my professional title is what I do when I leave work, which is I'm parent. I parent 4 children who I adopted from foster care here in the state of Tennessee, and you can see a little picture of my family there. I have 2 boys and 2 girls. My oldest and youngest are girls, and the middle 2 are boys. And when my husband and I started this foster care journey, I had no idea that it was going to lead me into a professional career and having a family of 6. We began our work as foster parents with the intention that all the children that we fostered would return to their birth families and go home and have that kind of ending to their foster care story. But as you know, planning only gets you so far, and I'm really glad that my plan did not go as I intended, because I have great children and I love the work that I do here at Harmony. I do a lot of training and consulting with foster and adoptive families, and for the last year I've been involved with a very special training on the neurosequential model of therapeutics, and I'm training as a non-clinician with Dr. Bruce Perry. And so a lot of the things that we talk about tonight will really be based in his work. I find that his work just really resonates with me personally, and that I was using a lot of those techniques organically with my own children, because we sure struggled in those first years. And I know that many of you are struggling with discipline as parents, and that those of you who are professionals are supporting families who are really hurting and who are having difficulty making things work with their children. And so I really want to encourage you, before we get to the meat of the lesson, to stay that course with these families. They need you. I know as an adoptive family that often the professionals in our lives became our family, and they were the people who stood by us when our children were in really tough spots and when we as parents were in really tough spots. And so professionals, hang in there, and parents, I really want you to feel seen tonight and know that there are people all over the country and the world that are doing this job. There are people who are with you in the trenches. Sometimes it really feels like a very deep trench, but there are people there who are rooting for you and rooting for your children to succeed and for your family to succeed. And so I really thank you for being with me tonight, and we're going to move through this information about discipline. I'm going to take my webcam away, and then we're going to just look at some of our slides. One of the things that I would really like to encourage you to do is check out some information about the National Permanency Conference, which is going to happen in the fall here in Nashville, Tennessee. And our keynote speaker is Dr. Bruce Perry, and he will be giving morning talks both days of the conference, talking about the intersection of neuroscience and permanency, talking about how the brain and brain development affects our children and affects our parenting style and affects the work that you do as a professional. So he will be doing morning talks and also a dinner. And then after his talks, we'll be doing breakout sessions on all kinds of topics and modes of intervening with children who have been exposed to trauma, to abuse and neglect. And conferences like this are really what keep me going as a parent and professional, is when I see that there are people out there doing this work, that there are new ideas, that there are new ways of looking at my children's behavior and what's going on with them, and new ways for me to approach discipline and to approach therapeutic interventions and just to approach parenting my children. So I know that after this webinar, you'll receive an email about our future offerings, including a webinar next month. And I'm going to include some information about the National Permanency Conference. We would love to have you there. This is really a great group of professionals who will be talking about neuroscience and its effect on permanency. So please be looking for that. So as a parent and as a professional that works with adoptive and foster families, discipline is really one of the biggest challenges that I hear about. And I know as a brand new foster parent, discipline and dealing with inappropriate and poor behaviors was one of the things that was really, really challenging for me. And typically, this is challenging for us because the types of discipline and the types of interventions that we use with children who are not traumatized look very, very different than the types of interventions and discipline that we use with kids who have been through abuse, neglect, prenatal substance exposure, and who have been removed from their family of origin. And so we want to look at discipline through that lens. I often think about times when I was growing up and my parents needed to discipline me, and what those looked like, they were so based in the history that I had with my family. When I was a teenager, I remember sitting up close to the front in church. My parents sat in the back, and I sat up with a group of teenagers and a little guy that I was pretty fond of. And so instead of listening to the church service, we were chit-chatting, which I knew was inappropriate in that setting, and that my parents would not think that was a great choice. But I continued to do that, and about 20 minutes into the service, I felt a presence behind me. Now, this presence did not do or say anything for a while, but I simply knew that was my father, and that he had left his seat in the church building and come to sit behind me. Eventually, he did put his hand on my shoulder, and that was his discipline. That was the intervention that he used. And that particular hand on the shoulder came with tons and tons of meaning, because I had tons and tons of history with my dad. And so what I knew that meant was, you have done something that is not okay. I am unhappy about this. I am disappointed in this, and you're probably going to receive some sort of consequence, but this isn't the appropriate time. And then I think about when my own children came to live with me, and the idea that all I would need to do is put my hand on their shoulder or give them a look across the room, which was simply enough for me, was just not even going to work with them. They literally did not know what that look meant. They didn't know what that facial expression meant. Me putting my hand on their shoulder may even be a trigger to them and upset them, because someone touching them from behind had meant danger in the past. And so the things that we grew up receiving as discipline, and that we may do with our other children in our lives, children we've had long histories with, children who haven't been abused, those things are often not going to work with the kids that we parent. And so what we want to do is think about the difference there. What is the big difference in the children that we may have been and other children that we parent and our foster and adoptive kids? And the answer to that is trauma. So let's think about, what does trauma mean? Trauma threatens the life or physical integrity of children or of someone important to that child. So this may be a mother, a grandparent, a sibling, or even a pet. Trauma causes an overwhelming sensation of terror, helplessness, and horror. And it also produces physical effects. So when a child is experiencing trauma, their heart may pound, they may have rapid breathing, trembling, dizziness, or even loss of bladder or bowel control. Trauma is this frightening and overwhelming experience that happens to a child. And some children may remember many parts of their trauma, but other children may have had these traumatic experiences before they could tell us about them. But that trauma still changes the way that they think, and it brings those body sensations of the pounding heart, the rapid breathing. So let's look at some of the types of trauma children in foster care and who join us through adoption may have experienced. Some of these are abuse, and this would be physical or sexual abuse. Any child who comes into our lives through foster care or trauma has experienced some type of trauma, but abuse is one of the more common ones. Neglect is also incredibly common, and neglect means that the child's physical and emotional needs were not met. This can often be children who were not fed regularly, children who did not receive appropriate sensory input, children who were not held or touched as infants, children who come from congregate care settings like an orphanage, where yes, they received a bottle, but they did not receive with that eye contact, holding and rocking, the things that develop that child's brain. So neglect is really common in our children. Traumatic events such as terrorism, things like children who were involved in the 9/11 attacks, children who come from war-torn countries or refugee children. It may be things like a flood or a fire or even medical trauma. And then prenatal insult. And this can be things such as drug and alcohol exposure, which we know really affects that child's development and subsequent behaviors. It can also be a mother who is not receiving appropriate prenatal care. So she is not getting the type of nutrition that she needs. She's living in a very stressful situation, and her body is just full of stress hormones, which are then passed on to the baby and change the way that that infant develops. All of these are considered trauma. Another trauma that we know happens to all of our children is that break from their family of origin, that break from whoever was caring for them, even if they were caring for the child sporadically or not that well. That removal and separation is certainly a trauma that changes that child and has large effects on the child in the future. So we know that if the child is with us because of foster care or adoption, that that child has been through some type of trauma, and it's really very likely that that child has been through multiple traumas. When I think about children who have joined my family from foster care, most of them had all of those traumas. They've had physical or sexual abuse. They were neglected, they did not receive appropriate food or nutrition, and things happen to these children because they're living in these environments that don't happen to children who have that appropriate nurturing and foundational care. And so we know that when kids come to us with trauma, that impacts their emotional, their mental health, their physical health, and it also affects their development as a human being. One of the ways that we know this, and I get so excited when I talk about this study because I think it really helped me to understand my children better and to understand why they had some of the behaviors and the physical and mental manifestations that they had. I learned about the ACE study a few years ago, and I'm so happy that when I teach families and professionals that more and more people know and understand the ACE study. And so I'm going to just give you a brief overview. In the 90s, a doctor in California who worked in a hospital setting with patients who were having bariatric surgeries or weight loss surgeries began to notice that many of his clients had sexual abuse in their past. And as he began to take note of this, he realized that it was not just anecdotal, but it was a very significant portion of his patients who revealed that they had past sexual abuse. And so this scientist, Vincent Felitti, did what scientists do, and he designed a study because he wanted to know what caused this and if there really was some relationship between this abuse and then things like obesity in the future. And so what he did was he designed a study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And adverse childhood experiences simply means bad things that happen to people when they're children. And so he gave these folks a mix of men and women, mostly from higher income families, folks who had insurance, because he did this research through the Kaiser Permanente Hospital in California. And what he did was ask them a series of questions that identified 10 areas of adversity. And what he noted is after he received these questionnaires and synthesized this information is that the number of adverse childhood experiences directly correlates with an individual's risk for negative health outcomes. So when children are exposed to more negative experiences in adulthood, they have more issues with physical health, mental health, and behavioral health. And you see in this little graphic here, some of the physical and mental health outcomes are things like obesity, as we talked about, diabetes, depression, STDs. We think that maybe things like depression, that might make sense to us, but we also see physical manifestations of this trauma, things like broken bones in adulthood, strokes, COPD, even cancer. And so the ACE study really says that what happens to us in childhood matters in our adulthood. And when I heard about this study, it really changed how I wanted to interact with my kids and how I felt about their poor behaviors. When I could see that science tells us what happens to children has lifelong consequences, it really made me feel so much more compassionate toward my children, toward their birth parents, just toward people who I maybe didn't understand their behaviors before. And the one sentence that Dr. Felitti wrote that still makes me just makes the hair on my arm stand up every time I think about it. He said, early childhood trauma is to adult mental health diagnosis as smoking is to cancer. And so again, to me, that just helped me to understand that what happens to children in their earliest years ripples throughout their adulthood, right? We know that not everyone who smokes gets cancer, and certainly not everyone with cancer smokes. And so we know that not everyone who has poor experiences has poor outcomes, but when we look at those relationships, it really helps us to cement that these experiences change our children's development and change their behaviors. Some of the outcomes that were very, very shocking to me early in my introduction to the ACE study were these. When people have no ACEs in a random study, about 1 in 14 has heart disease. When people have 1 to 3 ACEs, so that's 1, 2, or 3 adverse childhood experiences, things like a parent incarcerated, physical abuse, and early neglect, that person has a 1 in 7 risk of heart disease. So it increases exponentially. In someone who has 7 or more ACEs, they have a 1 in 6%, 1 in 6 has heart disease. I want you to think about the child that you are parenting or a child that you work with. And if that child comes from the child welfare system, it is quite likely that they have 3, 4, or even 7 to 10 ACEs. One of my own children has all the ACEs, 10. And so when we look at that and then look at the risk and the probability of outcomes, we can see how much those early years affected these kiddos. This one too, I think, is pretty staggering. In a random sample of folks with no ACEs, 1 in 96 attempts suicide. In a group of folks with 7 or more ACEs, 1 in 5 attempts suicide. And so I think knowing where our children come from, often where their birth families come from, can really help us look at their behaviors and their challenges with these fresh eyes of compassion, which helps me to interact with my kids in new ways. Besides the ACE study, there's also been a lot of study that talks about the global impact of abuse and neglect on children's development. And so I want to look at a couple of areas where we see developmental impacts. And I want you to think about the children that you are parenting and see if this rings true for you. Children who have gone through trauma are impacted in the domain of attachment. Children who have attachment challenges really don't trust adults. They find it very, very challenging to have reciprocal relationships with peers and adults. They often have problems with their caregivers, feeling close to them and feeling that parental closeness, and that is one of the impacts of trauma. We see that trauma impacts the child's biology, and that goes back to our ACE study. We know that what happens in childhood shows up again in adulthood in their biology, in heart disease, in things like breathing diseases, their risk of having things like sensory integration disorder. So biology is that physical health and brain, and we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the brain because I find it fascinating, and again, just this point where I can really help myself to interact with my children in ways that help them succeed. I love thinking about this stuff in relationship to the kids that I parent, and so I want you to do the same throughout this presentation. Trauma impacts affect regulation. This means how children behave, what you see on the outside. So when children are having sad and angry feelings, how do they show those? Kids who have dealt with a lot of trauma have major difficulties regulating those feelings and regulating the way that they express them and how they show what's going on inside of them. So affect regulation can be impacted. Dissociation, and many of us think of dissociation as kind of this way that children escape the pain of their trauma, and it can be, and it can look very frightening, but it can also look like things like laziness. So a child that just sort of sits there when you talk to them, they may be having dissociative moments. And so we know that trauma causes dissociation issues. We certainly see trauma impact our kids' behaviors, and we will talk tons about that in the next bit. Trauma can affect our children's cognition. It affects thinking and learning. Kids who are dealing with trauma often have school challenges that look like things like ADHD. They have trouble attending. They have trouble staying on task. Those kids often can do some tasks one day and then it's as if they had never seen the task the next day. And boy, does that push buttons as a parent or a caregiver, because you think, you know how to do that, kiddo. You did it yesterday. But cognition and memory can be affected by trauma. And again, we're going to look at that when we look at our brain information. Trauma also impacts children's self-concept. Children who have been hurt, who've been sexually abused, who have been neglected, ignored. Those children also often have real challenges with things like shame and self-esteem and feeling like they understand their place in the world. I used to teach the classes that were required in our state for families to be licensed as foster parents. And one of the things that I would ask in the opening classes when folks came in super excited to do this job, and I wanted them to be super excited, but I also wanted them to know that sometimes our children are really, really challenging. And one of the things I would ask is this: if you were looking for a friend, would you look for someone who has difficulty with relationships, who has a hard time staying on task, who has memory issues, who often drifts away and appears that they are not paying attention, that they're lazy, that they're bored, that they don't like themselves very much? The answer to that for most of us is, well, no, we would not necessarily go out looking for someone with those traits. But when we invite children who've been impacted by trauma to be part of our lives, we're doing just that. Trauma impacts global development. It doesn't just impact behavior. It doesn't just impact things like the child's feeling about who they are and how they fit in the world. It really impacts them in all of these realms, and it impacts each child differently. And at different stages in that child's growth and development, these areas will become more and less apparent. And so I just want you to remember as we walk through this that our children's development has been affected in every realm, some more than others, but every part of them has been touched by trauma and changed by trauma. And when we discipline and when we teach, we want to keep that in mind. Here's the most important part to me. Trauma impacts our children's brain development, their neurological development. Bruce Perry has come up with this really great and easy to understand way to show us visually how the brain develops. And he calls this the neurosequential model. Neuro meaning it's neurological, and sequential means it develops in a specific order every time. It develops in a sequence. And so the brain develops from the bottom to the top and from the inside to the outside. And it does that for all children. And so the brain stem, that bottom part of the brain, is the first to develop. And what the brain stem does is it regulates things like your heart rate, your physiological needs inside of your body. And it also regulates the fight, flight, or freeze response, which I hope all of you are aware of, that our children kind of go into this fight or flight mode when they are in a trauma situation, or they have a trauma reminder, or even for many of our kids, just something stressful will send them into fight, flight, or freeze. And this is the part of the brain that develops first. So it's really strong in our bodies because we need to run if something is chasing us, right? And so the brainstem develops first, then our midbrain, and that is our coordination and our movement. And when we think about our children, we often think, my goodness, they're never still, they never sit still, they're always laying on the chair with their head on one side and their feet on the other side, they're upside down, they have these sensory issues, they can't stand loud noises. Well, the midbrain is the part of the brain that regulates that. Then we move up to our green section there, which is the limbic part of the brain. This is the emotional response. This is the area that regulates our emotional responses and how we feel and react. And then the cortical portion of the brain is at the top. This is the last to develop. And I think most of us, if we think about children, we know that. It says that the cortical part of the brain is what controls us, right? Kids have challenges controlling themselves because their cortex, the top part of the brain, is the last to develop. And so the brain develops from the bottom to the top in this very predictable order. And each part of the brain does something different. So Dr. Perry says that if the world you're raised in is chaotic and threatening, if it's impoverished in love, in words, in social connection, the brain will reflect that. This is super important. You will develop systems in your brain so that you are more reactive, more hypervigilant. You are prepared to live in a world that is threatening, unpredictable, and chaotic, and it will lead to inevitably problems in how you negotiate your way through the rest of life. So when we look back at that slide, when the brain is developing, if the child is not safe, if they are not nurtured, if they are not receiving appropriate developmental input, the brain will not develop in the appropriate way. And what we see from that is kids whose brains develop in very reactive ways, in ways that make them hypervigilant, in ways that make them super unpredictable, in ways that their brains just become chaotic. And that follows them through their life. And so we're going to look at this photo. This is actually a PET scan of a brain. I love seeing the science again because the hard science can help me with the softer sciences, with going, how do I approach my child? Well, when I look at this PET scan, you see on the left, there's this healthy brain, and this is a 3-year-old child. This is a healthy 3-year-old. We see that up at the top in those temporal lobes in the cortex, in that part that helps the child with self-control, with higher level thinking, with things like empathy and understanding how to synthesize a past experience and apply it to a present experience. There's a lot going on in this healthy, nurtured child. You see that it's red and yellow, and those are the most active areas. So you can see, look how active this brain is. So this is a child that can think, oops, my mom's not looking, but I know she said not to take this cookie. And they can reason through that, and they can think about the consequences of that, what might happen if I take this cookie. They can think about another time they took a cookie and they got in trouble, or the mom was disappointed. They have that higher level functioning. Now, the child is young, so it's not fully developed, but it's still there, and it's working, and it's active. And then we see the brain on the other side. This is also a PET scan of a child. But this child grew up in an orphanage in Eastern Europe. And so some of us may think, but my kid didn't grow up in an orphanage in Eastern Europe. And that may be true. But I know I can speak for myself. My child grew up sitting in the back seat of a car a lot and not getting fed very often. And so all that good brain development was not happening to him. So his brain is pretty likely to look like this. What's happening up there in the temporal lobes is very, very different. We see a lot of black. We see blue, a little bit of green, and a little bit of red and yellow, but not like we saw in that healthy brain. So this child has much less activity going on in her or his cortex. So this child is told, don't eat that cookie, you have to save it for later. And this child does not have the resources to go back in time and say, What happened the last time I did this? They may not even have the resources to stop their hand from just reaching out and grabbing it while you as the parent are saying, hey, don't eat this. They may have that type of impulse control issue. So we see the frontal part of this child's brain, the highest part of the brain, is simply not developed in the same way that the healthy child's brain is developed. There is also some stuff going on here in the back of the brain. Back here at the bottom, what we see is a lot more red and yellow on our neglected child. This is the fight or flight area. So this child has a lot more of those primitive impulses going on. So this kiddo who has been neglected is far more likely to react to stimulus in the environment, to react when they're told not to do something or to do something, to just react from the lower part of their brain, that fight or flight, that protective space, than they are with more thoughtful reactions. While our healthy child, yep, stuff's going on back there, right? They need to save themselves if they're in danger, but it's not on fire, as it were, right? This is not all lit up. I think about this a lot when I'm dealing with my kids' most challenging behaviors. I think about what's going on in their brain. Do they even have the neurological resources to make better choices right now? And if they don't, then my job is not to be angry with them. My job is not to punish them. My job is to think, how do I build this resource now so that next time we can do better? Next time he can do better or she can do better. So trauma not only impacts our kids' global development, we can see from the brain scans that it impacts our children's neurological development. Traumatized kids are wired for fear. And as a parent, boy, do I get caught up here a lot. I am not wired for fear. I am wired for fun. I want to have fun with my children. I want to have fun with my family. And so when there are new experiences, I feel excited to experience those with my kids, with my family. But my children's brains have been wired for fear. They see new experiences, new places, different places, new smells. They see those as something that may be dangerous, and their brain has evolved in a way that helps them avoid those dangerous situations because of what they went through at a very young age. And so kids' brains are wired for fear when they come from these places of intense trauma, abuse, and neglect. This goes against conventional wisdom in a lot of ways, and it certainly goes against some of the things that I was taught and told as a brand new foster parent. But science has borne out that the earlier the trauma and neglect is, the more detrimental the impact is. So many of us as foster parents or adoptive parents have thought or been told, my goodness, they were so young, they won't remember that. And while the child may not have recall of the memory and be able to tell you what happened, children who are neglected and traumatized very early on have very significant impacts in their development and neurological development. And so the timing of those insults, not just the duration of it, not just what it was, can determine the impact of the developing system. The way that Dr. Perry explained this to us in his learning groups is that for us as adults or even teenagers, when something bad happens, when we see a trauma, we already have this basic network of brain connections that help us to determine how we're going to react to that. So we already have a network, and hopefully our network is pretty healthy, that says, wow, that is scary. My body is having a reaction, but I can calm myself down. When those experiences of trauma and neglect happen while the brain is developing, the development occurs in a way that is not healthy. And so the brain actually develops systems that are unhealthy. The lower parts of the brain, those that develop first, are not as changeable, as plastic or malleable as the upper parts of the brain. So that fight or flight system is not quite as changeable as our rational thought, as getting new information, considering it, and going, I might have been wrong. Our bodies often react to those lower brain systems just in such a quick way that we don't have time to think through. Is that really dangerous or not? So if the brain was developed in this dangerous and chaotic situation, the reactivity is so much higher than it is when the brain has developed in a nurturing and appropriate environment. And so the earlier this neglect and trauma happens to our kids, the more detrimental the impact is. So we know that yes, our kids may not be able to tell us what they saw or what happened to them when they were 2 years old or 1 year old, but their bodies and brains have been impacted by those experiences. The way that I like to think about this is that our children's experiences and brains build them just like a wall. If the cracks are at the bottom, if the cracks are in the foundation, then things are not as stable for them. And what we often see in kids with these unstable buildings of their development and their brain development are attachment challenges, right? We see kids who really have trouble attaching to caregivers. We see neurological deficits. We see kids who are very challenged by schoolwork. They have a hard time attending and listening in class. We see kids who cannot deal with their emotions and do not know how to read other people's emotions well. Kids who are just bathed in shame, who have that core of shame, that I don't know what it is, but something is wrong with me, something is different about me. They have executive functioning challenges. So executive functioning is how our brain takes in all the tons of information that we get at one time and decides what's important, what do I need to bring to the forefront. You're doing this now, right? So you're listening to me, but I guarantee lots of you are doing other things at the same time. So if there's an emergency in your home, your kiddo needs a Band-Aid, you have the executive functioning to just switch over and go, I can help you, kiddo, and then you can come back and attend to the seminar, to the webinar. So executive functioning is how we move between different things that are going on. It's that air traffic control in our brain. And when kids have trauma histories, that becomes very challenging for them. Impulse control issues. So this is that child that just can't not take the cookie right off your hand, even though you said this is for later. Children who cannot control those impulses, this is often due to neurological issues, to those development issues. So what we see are these trauma symptoms, the attachment, the affect regulation, those feelings of shame, of thinking something is weird about me, something's wrong with me, but I don't know what it is, that impulse control. These trauma symptoms show up as poor behavior or inappropriate behavior, right? They show up as behaviors that we as parents have to deal with or that we as teachers need to deal with. And so I have often internally thought to myself when one of my children is doing something inappropriate, I know this is about trauma, but what I see and what other people see is a kid laying on the floor screaming because they didn't get what they want. So trauma symptoms will often show up as inappropriate behaviors. And we need to, as parents and professionals, make sure that we can relate the two in our minds of knowing this behavior is not just a rotten kid. This has to do with the child's previous experiences. Here are some typical trauma responses, and these may really resonate with you if you are parenting a child who comes from foster care or a child who has been adopted. These are very, very typical responses to trauma, but I will also tell you none of them are fun to parent. Children who blow up when they are corrected or who don't get what they want. This one is big. Whenever I'm talking with parents, they say, this kid is fine until he doesn't get what he wants. And so we're going to talk a little bit about reframing that. Often our kids have a real challenge understanding that a denial now doesn't mean you will be withheld from forever. And they often see not getting their needs met, even if the need is maybe a Snickers in the grocery store, as this is just how it is for me. I never get my needs met. And so I want us to reframe this as not a child who just doesn't get what they want, but a child who feels that their needs are not being met. Defiance, this is a big one. Lots of our kids appear really defiant, and this is a typical trauma response. Fighting, becoming aggressive, especially if they're criticized, if they are given direction that feels intrusive to them, or children who are teased. We see a lot of fighting with peers, with our children who feel like someone is teasing them, who a child's making fun of them. A trauma response is that we see often is resisting change or resisting transitions. Transitions are one of the hardest parts of the day for all of my children. And my children have been with me for quite a long time. The improvement that they have is just vast in so many ways. They're just such great kids, but transitions still throw them off. A friend of mine said she took her son to get his hair cut, her adopted son, and he had a big old meltdown. And she said, dude, what's up? And he said, you can't just spring this on me. And I think of a haircut, like, sure, I would just go and get a haircut if my mom said go get a haircut. But for this child, that transition of this is what I'm going to do and having mom say, no, you're going to get a haircut was so overwhelming. That is certainly a trauma response. Children who are unusually protective of personal space. And this one is very often related to sexual abuse or physical abuse. And we often see children who shrug off our affection. You may put your hand on their back and they just shrug you off or say, don't touch me. And sometimes we think of this as an attachment challenge, but what may be happening is that this is about personal space, that we have crossed that barrier of what feels comfortable to that child because of their past. And so this is a trauma response. It's not just a poor behavior. Children who revert to younger behaviors. This is a big trigger for lots and lots of parents. But I want us to, tonight, when we look at some interventions, to think of children who revert to younger behaviors not as an annoyance, but really as an opportunity. When our children are reverting to younger behaviors, they are asking to have needs met that were not met at the appropriate developmental stage. And so instead of thinking of those reverting behaviors, those babyish behaviors as annoyances and bad behavior, I really challenge you, and it will be a challenge when your 12-year-old son is talking baby talk and all you need to do is get to the grocery store. But I challenge you to think of these reverting behaviors as opportunities to meet needs that were not met at the appropriate time. Frequently seeking attention is considered a typical trauma response. And seeking attention is here in quotes because I, again, want us to reframe this. Our kids need attention. Our kids very often were not held and rocked and stared at and looked at with love and compassion. Think about how you just hold an infant. Our kids were often not held that way. They weren't just loved on. And so these attention-seeking behaviors are often an attempt to get that, to get this type of unconditional and positive love that they're missing and that they've missed out on in appropriate ways. So attention-seeking behaviors are a trauma response that we often look at as a really bad behavior. Distrust of adults and distrust of authority. This is a biggie for our kids. Our children have reason to distrust adults. The adults who raised them in many cases, the adults who hurt them in many cases, were not trustworthy. And so when our children were developing those understandings of what adults do and how adults relate to children, they did not develop in a typical way, which is, hey, adults are here to protect me. Their brain developed, that system developed in a way that says, adults are out to get me, so I'm going to have to manage myself. And so that distrust of adults and authority can lead to some really, really challenging behaviors. And this can often lead to behaviors that get our kids in big trouble, right? That end up in court, that end up with our kids in facilities, in residential facilities, because they're not obeying the law. But we really, again, want to reframe the way we think about it. It doesn't mean that we get to give our kids a pass and say you don't have to follow the instructions of adults. But what it means is that we need to let them know, I get that you don't trust this. I get that authority is challenging for you. And so our kids often have that response of total distrust for authority. And I see this in one of my children a great deal. She's a teenager, and she came to me at 5 with complete lack of trust and respect for authority, because all the authority figures in her life had hurt her. And so even now, man, she is not, she's not okay when people who she doesn't trust and feel connected with tell her what to do. It becomes a real challenge for her. And so we see that as a trauma response, not just a kid making poor choices and being disrespectful. Lying and stealing, and these are huge triggers for families because we base our relationships for the most part on trust. We base our relationships with friends and family on, they're not going to lie to me, they are telling me the truth. And we have in so many cases given up a lot to adopt or to foster children. And then when they take things that belong to us, it really, really pushes our buttons. And so again, we want to reframe these behaviors and think about what do they mean, what is their purpose, and again, put them under the column of this is a trauma response. This isn't just a bad kid. If you leave today with only a handful of things, and I hope you leave with a basket full, what I want you to leave with is that these behaviors that we see as just rotten kids are kids who have evolved to deal with the life that they had, and that we need to look at these in a new way and respond in a new way. Food issues, this is a big one, again, quite triggering, especially if you have strong beliefs about things like cleaning your plate or what foods need to be eaten when or where foods need to be eaten. These can be really challenging for foster families, but they're also super common, and oftentimes they are tied directly to food being withheld or unavailable to children in the past. And then we just have strange behaviors. I think so many of us have witnessed behaviors and just thought to ourselves, what is that? We know it's not typical. Sometimes it's pretty embarrassing, but we know that something is up. And when we see these odd behaviors, it's so helpful for us, again, to just look at it, to take a beat, to think about what could this mean. So these are typical trauma responses, and we are going to look at some of these and look at some direct interventions for some of these. I certainly want to tell you that any of these interventions can be helpful, but all of these interventions will not work for you or your family or your child. I want to give you a magic bullet, but unfortunately there isn't one. The magic comes when we as parents synthesize our own experiences with our children, when we do lots of observations, when we take trainings like this and learn maybe even just 2 or 3 new skills or new ways of thinking. That's when the magic happens. So just know that we're not going to talk about every one of these behaviors, but we're going to pull out a few and then look at some ways that we can handle them or new ways we can look at them. And I will certainly be talking about experiences that I have had. I will be telling you about a lot of experiences where I was successful with my children. But I don't want you to leave this call thinking, wow, she's really, really good at this. This call would be really long. We'd be deep into the night if I spent time telling you all the things that I did wrong, because there were a lot of them. There are a lot of them. We're all human beings. When we are faced with these types of behaviors, it's hard, and we become challenged by them. We get irritated with them. We may have had a long day at work, and just the idea of having to deal with another tantrum makes us tired. And so I want you to know, yes, these responses are typical. They happen to almost all adoptive and foster families, but we are also human beings. And so we're going to mess up. But the best thing to do is say to yourself, I messed up, that was a bad one, I'm going to try it again. I'm going to do it again tomorrow, and I'm going to do it better. So I'm going to walk through several responses to some of these behaviors and some new ways to look at them. But I want you right now to allow yourself to know that this will not always go smoothly, and that's okay. It's going to go. And it's going to go again and again until you will realize, hey, this one is working, and I will do this one for a long time till it's not working. And then you'll come across a new behavior, and you'll start again at the beginning going, what does this behavior mean? Where does it come from? How can I best handle it? So this is certainly not to beat up families who have done things in older ways, in ways that are not trauma sensitive. That is where we all started. And so I want us to think about moving forward in ways that are going to make our lives simpler and certainly more pleasant. That is my goal, is to make discipline just easier for myself and for my children. So you see a doorbell. I don't know if you heard a doorbell, but there was a little doorbell ringing. And this doorbell is here because for years I was attempting to discipline a behavior as if my son were choosing to be a rotten kid. Every time our doorbell rang for years, for a number of years, my son would do what we called in the last slide odd behaviors. At this time he was young. He was between about 4 and 7. And when the doorbell would ring, my little guy would do things like climb up a bookshelf and perch on top, which doesn't work well. So lots of books would fall down. And of course, I am trying to stop that from happening and also answer the door and stop my other kids from screaming. He would do things like run into the bathroom and wrap his body in the shower curtain after the doorbell rang, which would pull the shower curtain down, cause problems in the bathroom. Again, I was trying to do lots of things at once, and I was not handling any of it very well. So literally for years, when my child would hear our doorbell ring, he would behave in ways that really were very, very strange and disruptive, and frankly made me really, really angry because I didn't get it. It didn't make sense to me. Every time the doorbell rang, to me, what I was hearing and what my brain was telling me is, ooh, it's a surprise. It might be a new box from Amazon. It might be a friend. It might be a new neighbor. When the doorbell rang to me, my response was neutral or happy, excited, because I thought it meant something fun. What my son was hearing was danger. What I learned years and years after my children came to live with me was that in the home where this kid previously lived, there was a lot of activity there was a lot of drug activity, which meant there were people coming in and out of the home selling and buying drugs. Many of those people were quite unsafe. Many of those people hurt my kids. And when he heard the doorbell, his lower brain said to him, scary, 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 scary. And so what he did was behave in ways that felt protective to him. To me, they felt crazy. I did not understand how climbing a bookshelf or trying to dive under a table and trashing our furniture was protective. But in his brain, he was trying to protect himself from something really, really frightening. And although nothing frightening was out there, it was mostly boxes from Amazon, his brain said, this is too scary, you are too vulnerable. Do whatever a 4 or 5-year-old can do to protect himself, which was hide, and he couldn't hide in ways that weren't destructive. When I figured it out, I made a change in myself. I didn't ask for him to change in that moment. Once I figured out that's what was happening, I changed what I was going to do. And I decided what I was going to do is ignore the doorbell. That person could come back later, or I could find that box later, and I was going to attend to my son. When I did that over and over and over again, he gradually became desensitized to that sound of the doorbell. And about, he's 11 now, so about a year and a half ago, our doorbell rang, and I didn't attend to him because he continued doing what he was doing. And after I had taken care of what was happening at the door, he got up out of his seat and came over to me and said, Mommy, I'm not scared of the doorbell anymore. If I had continued to basically punish my child for what I felt like was simply disruptive and rude behavior, but what was really a trauma response, he would not have been able to say to me, I'm not scared of that anymore. He would probably still be doing that behavior. And so when we understand that trauma is at the core of most of our children's worst behaviors, what we can do is really look at discipline through this fresh lens. And that's what I want us to do as we head through here. The model that I have begun using in the last few years, I've called the SET model. And this is the way that I attempt to handle all behavioral responses. But as I said, because I'm a human, I don't always do it right. But I can go back to this and think through how should I or would I have done this if I were following the model, and then try better next time. So the SET model begins with S, self-regulation. And this self-regulation is not for our children. This regulation is for us as parents. We must be self-regulated when we attend to our children's poor behaviors. The E stands for examine our expectations and exhibit empathy. So first we will regulate ourselves, then we will think about our expectation in this moment and show empathy to this child. And our T is for teaching new and better skills. Sometimes our children might already have the skill, and so what we'll need to do is reinforce the skill or reteach the skill. But sometimes we'll have to teach our child the skill. So when we think about the doorbell story with my son, The way that I began approaching the out of control behavior when the doorbell rang was first self-regulating, was first saying to myself, the doorbell can wait, right? I was regulating how many things am I going to do at once. I cannot do 5 at once. I can sometimes do 3 and not always that well. But I can self-regulate and decide which thing is most important, and at that moment it's attending to my child's behavior. I can examine my expectations and exhibit empathy for this child. So what were my expectations? Did I expect that this kid was going to behave in a logical manner when he is triggered? And the answer was yes, I did expect that, but that wasn't an appropriate expectation. And so I went through myself going, okay, he cannot do any better at this moment, and that's okay. I'm going to deal with it, and I'm going to exhibit empathy and say to him, you must be really scared, right? Then I can teach new skills after he's calm. And we're going to look at this in a variety of ways over and over through the next 30 minutes that we're together. And I want you to think about how you can apply this SET model to the behavior that's challenging you the most with your child in the moment. Again, S is for self-regulate, E is examine our expectations, exhibit empathy, and T is for teach new and better skills, or sometimes we'll be reteaching skills. And in the case of the doorbell, the skill that I taught my child was to be aware that the doorbell is triggering him, to say, you're doing this not because you're bad or there's something wrong with you, but because this is really scary. And what can we do when you're scared? And we gave him a huge amount of choices that he could pick from and decide what helped calm him in the moment. So the skill was for him to self-regulate. So let's look at what self-regulation for parents looks like. Kids without self-regulation skills need us to regulate them externally. We do this for infants, right? We pick up a crying infant. We do not say to that infant, you better calm down right now. That doesn't make any sense. An infant does not have the ability to self-regulate. Often neither do our kids, even when they're 8 or 5 or 11 or sometimes even 15. So what we need to do is we have to stay regulated to model and assist them in regulation. So one of the things we can do in our own self-regulation is think, I need to model for this child what this moment should look like. If the moment looks like me screaming at them, trying to pull my other kid off the bookshelf and try to get to the door in time, that's not what I want my child's behavior to look like. I want it to look calm, slow, and that's how I need to regulate myself. So part of our self-regulation is just simply so we can provide that regulation for our child. If they can't do it internally for a long, long time, we may have to help them do it externally. Another part of self-regulation is our own state of mind influences our child's state of mind. This quote comes from The Whole Brain Child, which is a great book by Dan Siegel and Tina Bryson. And I'm going to refer to this book several times as we proceed. But this is a really great, it's a thin little book, and I think that it gives lots of suggestions on ways to help our kids through challenging behaviors. But Dr. Siegel says, you know, when we're out of control, when we are dysregulated, it influences how our children feel. We know this is true, right? When we come home from work and our spouse or our child is dysregulated, it influences how we feel and how we begin to react in a lot of ways. And so as the adult, our state of mind can really influence that child. And so our own self-regulation can influence our child's self-regulation. However, if we are dysregulated when our child is misbehaving, then it's going to be much more challenging for the child to find a place of regulation. We also have to be really, really aware as parents of what's going on inside of us. Now, this could be its own hour-and-a-half webinar. Actually, this is probably for most of us our lifetime work, is becoming self-aware. What's going on with us? Sometimes our children's behaviors are simply just triggers for us. Think about in two-parent families how one parent, they can handle something like a child that screams a lot, but the other parent is like, that drives me nuts. And so we have to be aware of our own triggers. We have to dig into that mindfulness and self-awareness of going, what's going on here? Is this just triggering me? Sometimes our children actually aren't misbehaving. I think of very early on as a parent when I had two little guys, about 3 and 4. They had been severely traumatized, and I was real busy making a lot of rules about stuff that didn't matter. And a lot of that was because of my own triggers. So I would have kids that in the parking lot wanted to jump in a puddle, and I would make that, you know, a thing that caused us a problem for the rest of the day. It took me a long time to just simply realize, what's the big deal about this kid jumping in a puddle? But it's simply because that was one of my own triggers, is the idea, oh no, this kid's going to get dirty, they're going to be wet, they're going to sit in the car. What happened is once I let the child jump in the puddle, they determined, I don't like being dirty and wet, and they stopped that behavior. But when I was attempting over and over to put these arbitrary controls on the child, it really just exploded, when a little bit of self-awareness and mindfulness could have stopped that. So just be aware of your own triggers. Certainly doesn't mean that your children don't have to follow rules, but what it does mean is maybe we could have less rules. I know that I really don't like hanging out with people that are always telling me no, and so I'm fairly sure my children feel the same way. And if it's going to be a power struggle, I'm going to let things go that aren't about danger, that aren't about morality, that don't have long-term effects. If you want to jump in a puddle, jump in a puddle. If you want to wear silly clothes to school, you wear silly clothes to school. Those were things that triggered me. They weren't actually bad behaviors. Those were control issues that I was holding on to. Another one of the things that we need to think about with our own self-regulation is that parenting traumatized kids can open up our old wounds. This can be things that happened to us in our childhood. This can be feelings and thoughts about ourselves that we've put to the side or that we feel like we've dealt with. Parenting a traumatized kid will ramp that right back up. I'm going to share that I really dislike feeling disrespected. I really hate it. And when my children do things that make me feel disrespected, I have to just self-regulate like crazy. Them being what I would consider disrespectful in the moment is kind of an old wound. It's about not feeling heard, not feeling like my own thoughts and feelings are important. But that's not my kid's problem. That's my problem. That's my challenge. And so being able to separate, to kind of suss out sometimes, is this a kid issue? Is this really the child doing something inappropriate that needs to be dealt with? Or is this something that just stirs up some old things in myself? A lot of times I will notice that I am the worst parent in the world when I am tired. That's some self-awareness. I gotta sleep. And so knowing that, is this kid really being a grade A jerk today, or am I just really tired? It can take a little teasing out for me, but oftentimes when I tease it out, it's not that my kid's being a grade A jerk. It's that I'm really, really tired. That's my own stuff. So that self-regulation piece in the SET model is to think about, how can I regulate myself? If I'm feeling disrespected, I will walk away. So if my kid is doing some back talk to me, I will often just walk away. It doesn't mean I'm going to leave them there to do something dangerous, but I may call in my husband and say, I need some assistance right now, or I may say to my child, I just need a second. I promise that I'll talk to you about this as soon as I'm calm. And I go and sit on my front porch. So I'm sure that my neighbors often wonder, why does that nice lady just sit on her porch all day long? So I go out there and sit, relax, get myself back, and then I can come back in and face the challenge, knowing that I've separated out what's my stuff and what's really a discipline issue. So self-regulation is a big deal here. Examining our expectations is huge. We have to let go of the expectation that our kids see the world in the same way we do. They don't. Our kids have often been through situations that make their worldview very skewed and very different from ours. All of my children feel like they need to get what is owed to them or get what they need quickly, or it will be gone. And that's not the way that I see the world. I really view the world as there's more than enough to go around, and when there's not, we can share, which may give you a little insight into my idealism, but my kids see the world as a place of deprivation. They do not see the world in the same way I do, and I have to let go of the idea that I'm going to convince them somehow to see it my way. We as parents have to let go of the expectation that we can use logic to make our kid get it. Logic happens at the top part of the brain. When kids are stressed, when they are misbehaving, they are living out of that lower brain, and logic will not work. Recently someone asked me specifically about the idea of using these very logical techniques with their children, and I said, I think those are great for kids when they're regulated, but if your child is very dysregulated, they cannot be in logic. When emotion is high, logic is low. And so we need to let go of that expectation that we can logic our kids into figuring it out. We also need to let go of our expectation that our children's chronological, emotional, and developmental ages will match. It is quite likely that you will have an 11-year-old chronologically. Emotionally, that child may be 4, and developmentally, they are 8. That's the type of children that we parent, which makes them very complex. But when we can let go of the expectation that, yes, this is a big, strapping teenager, but he acts like a 4-year-old. When we can let go of the expectation that he's supposed to act like something else, then we can approach that child in a more empathetic way and help them to solve problems in the best way that they can. Children's brains are a work in progress. Kids who are developmentally on task are a work in progress, right? The higher cognitive functioning, the full frontal cortex isn't developed until the early 20s fully. And we can continue to learn and grow after that. I certainly hope so. We want our kids to continue to grow and learn. So just know that what they're doing today doesn't need to necessarily say that they will never be doing other things in the future. Yes, they may be emotionally immature today, but we need to look at them as a work in progress. When we meet their needs emotionally, they can grow. If we continue to just punish when the child is asking for something in a lower developmental area, then they're not going to be growing. So it's okay for our kids to be a work in progress, and it's okay for us to be a work in progress as parents. I love this picture. I just think I often wish my kids were wearing these t-shirts so that I could have that visual that, yep, I see a gorgeous 15-year-old girl, but inside is that neglected 2-year-old who sat and cried because they were hungry all day, right? And so our kids are a work in progress. They are not going to match up developmentally in all realms. And so we can work with our children by meeting their needs developmentally and letting go of that expectation that just because they're 16, they need to be doing very specific 16-year-old things. It's quite likely that because our children are 15 and they've been through huge amounts of traumatic stress, that they probably need to be doing things that 10-year-olds do to build those brain connections, to calm themselves, and to stay regulated. So the second E is exhibit empathy. You know, empathy is not about saying, I'm really sorry that happened to you. Empathy is about getting down in the dirt with someone. You know, it's getting our hands dirty. And this is challenging. It's really challenging to get dirty with someone, especially when our children are often just dealing with things that most of us find almost unimaginable. Before I became a foster parent, I thought, oh, I know those things happen, but they happen on TV. They happen in New York City. They happen in bigger cities than Knoxville, Tennessee. After I became a foster parent, I used to tell people, if you saw it on Law and Order, it happens in your neighborhood. These things happen all over the place, and they happen to very vulnerable children who need strong, stable adults to get down in it with them and get messy. Empathy assures our kids that they are not alone in their distress. We can sit with our kids when they cry. We can sit with them while they say things that are so challenging for us to hear about their families and what happened to them. We have to sit with our kids in their distress. And this can be really hard when their distress happens in the grocery store. But there have been more than one time in my parenting life that I've just sat in the grocery store floor and held my kid while they wailed because I wouldn't buy them cereal. But what I know is that they weren't wailing about cereal. They were wailing about all the other losses and all the other no's that they had heard in their lifetime. And so when we can empathize with our children, when we can get down there with them, they know they're not alone in this hurt. Empathy builds those connections, it strengthens connections, and truthfully it helps us feel closer to our children. If we want to maintain that connection, we've got to get in there and know how our children are feeling. So we have to have that empathy step. And here's how it may look. Again, this is from the Whole Brain Child. You know, you see this kid coming out of his bedroom at night with his hands crossed across his chest, and he said, "You never write me a note. You don't ever leave me a treat in my room." Now, if my kid came out of bed and said those things to me, my mind would immediately go, get your little self back in bed. But empathy says, I'm going to get down with you and go, I'm really sorry you're hurt. It sounds like you need a note. It sounds like you need to know I'm with you, even when I'm not in the bedroom with you. Here are some things I can do. Instead of commanding and saying, get out of here and go to bed, don't worry about that, what we want to do is connect with our child and say, I will be happy to help you figure out how we can do this. Let me walk with you to your bed. I can tell you're feeling bad. It can also look like something where we start with something positive. So we say to our child, you are doing a great job right now, but I see you're still playing your Kindle. I think I told you to put on your shoes. So right now, put it on your shelf, get your shoes on, and I'll come back in a few minutes. And then we again sandwich that directive between some more positive things. So my kids often are doing a great job sitting and playing the computer. They are doing it really appropriately, but they were supposed to be doing their chores. So I'm going to give that compliment. Then I'm going to say, this isn't what we're doing now, so let me find a way to help you, or let me give you a little time to get back to it, and then I can compliment you again when you're successful. So that empathy action can be saying, I see you're doing well in this area. How can I help you do well in the area I'm asking you to comply with right now? T is for teaching new and better skills. This is so important. Discipline does not have to mean consequences. We see discipline as consequences in so many ways. The timeout chair. Let's go stand in the corner. Right? I won't play with my Dragon Ball Z in class. Discipline doesn't have to be consequences. Discipline means teaching. Discipline means learning. Discipline to us is skill building. And so we want to teach our children new and better skills. all those cracks in the foundation, all those developmental challenges need to be filled in with new skills, and we get to do that. It really is a privilege that we get to do that for our children, that we get to teach them these skills that they have missed at the appropriate developmental time. And so when our kids are blowing up, when they are having a meltdown because they didn't get what we want, we are not going to try to teach them to swim while they're drowning. We're going to help them regulate. We're going to help them calm down. We're going to say, I'm here for you, and then help them move to the place of reason. We can say no to our children without saying no. No is a trigger for a lot of our kids. And so when we're having that cereal discussion, we may not just say, nope, not getting you that. We can say, that one looks good. It looks like the one you want. This is the one we're getting today. We haven't used the word no, but we're basically saying no. No can be a trigger word for our kid because it brings up that old feeling of deprivation. So I really spent a lot of time working on this with my child because no was a huge trigger for one of my children because he had been denied food for a long, long time. He had not been fed appropriately. So when I could say no without saying no, his reaction was much more gentle. We can give our kids space and time. Even now, one of my children often says no to me, and I just take a beat, usually about 30 seconds, which feels very long when I just want to go and get stuff done. But by the time I've waited those 30 seconds, he's actually typically gotten up and done the thing I asked him to do, even though the word out of his mouth was no. And so for children who have this immediate need to kind of push away from adults, they may say no, but we can give them a little space and time to comply and see what happens. For defiance, man, we need to change our stance. In a lot of cases, my children hate it when I stand above them when they're sitting. That makes them feel very frightened in a lot of ways, and I never even thought about it. We need to slow down and try again. So when children are being defiant, we can slow down, maybe give one direction. Wait, and then do it again. Use playfulness with defiance. Being playful has really changed the tone of my household. Here is actually one of the playful things I did with my son. He had a huge meltdown years ago. He kicked this bucket of Army Men, and it laid in our floor for a long time because I was not going to pick it up, and he also was not going to pick it up. So eventually I just left a note from the sergeant, and it said, any soldier not found in the barracks at 8 o'clock tonight will spend 10 days in the brig. So my plan was, if it wasn't picked up at 8, these guys were gone. They got picked up real quick, and they actually got picked up by the siblings as well because they thought it was fun and silly and funny, and it got things done. The battle was gone. The playfulness helped him to make that good choice. We need to give our kids concrete choices when they are defiant. We use passwords in our home. There are 3 passwords. They can use them once a day. This helps them to be able to basically say no to us. But there's 3 of them, and they are please help me. So if I say go put on your shoes, they could use the password please help me, which means I help them put on the shoes. They could say I need 3 minutes, or they can say I can't do that right now. And if putting on shoes is because we have to go out, then that's fine. They can say I can't do that right now, and I will take the shoes with us, and they can put them on in the car. But passwords don't mean that they never have to do it, and frankly, when we've used these, it helped the child feel so much control, basically they stopped using them. So it gave that child control. And that's what this is about, the child's rules. So we would often play games with the child's rules. Here we called it Haley's rules. And it's not the way the game was meant to be, but the child's in control and we all just did it. It didn't mean it got to be that way all the time, but man, it helps that kid feel so empowered. And they would also say, my way, please. So I would ask the child, can you do this? And they would say back to me, my way, please. And then we could attempt to basically negotiate. Sometimes the answer was still going to be no if it was a safety issue, obviously. Some things we couldn't change, but giving them those concrete choices really helps them feel in control. All trauma-sensitive interventions use rhythm, repetition, they have relations, and they're rewarding. And these are especially true for transitions, giving kids chants and raps. We have transition music, which we just play on our Amazon Echo. When it's time to go, the same song always plays. Doing physical activity at transition time, we have a line on the outside of our house with chalk, and before the kids come in, they have to jump up 3 times and touch the line. So doing that physical activity helps with transitions. Also, visual schedules are using alarms. So as we close, these interventions for things like just attention seeking or what I like to call just annoying behaviors is be proactive. If you know this is annoying to you, give attention before the behavior begins. We call this in our house the distress call. I know if I have not spent time with my child, then what happens is that the child is going to start making weird noises, which I call the distress calls, so I'm going to spend time with them before they do it. Look for the underlying need. Is it a sensory issue? Can I put sensory supports in place? And then the one that's just been magic for me is just being with. So when my child is making the distress call, I will sit beside this child and call back with the same sounds that he does. And what happened is that became our language together. And eventually the distress calls relinquished and we had connected. And so these annoying things that really pushed our buttons became something that we connected over because we could reflect. I could reflect that strange behavior back to this child. I could make those weird noises. I could sing those silly songs. I could walk in that weird way that my child does, because acceptance is magical. When we can be accepted, we feel fully at home with someone. And I want my children to feel fully at home with me. This is a picture of Halloween. A few Halloweens ago, we were carving pumpkins, and my child there in the left-hand corner said, "I don't want to carve, I want to smash." And I started saying, "Nope, no, we're not going to smash, no way." And my husband said, what's the big deal? So he did the right thing there by being with and being accepting. He said, "Let's smash this pumpkin together," and they did. And smashing a pumpkin is now part of our traditional Halloween. And when I think about what could have happened that night, I could have held my ground and said, "Absolutely not, you need to do what everyone else is doing." He would not have had a good time. But what happened is he did that. He had a great time. He said, "This is the best Halloween ever." And then we continued it as a tradition in our home. So knowing that sometimes just being with and accepting our child's strangeness, accepting their eccentricities can really eliminate those things in the future or make them more appropriate is so freeing. He needed sensory activity, and carving the pumpkin wasn't going to work, but smashing did. So sometimes our ability to just be with our children can be huge. So when we use the SET model, we're going to self-regulate first before inappropriate behaviors. We're going to examine our expectations and exhibit empathy and teach those new and better skills. Every interaction with our kids is an opportunity for growth and healing, even discipline, even when we have to change behaviors, even when we have to teach new behaviors. They all offer us an opportunity to help our children grow and heal. I really want you to know that I'm glad you joined us. You will receive your certificates through email in between 2 to 3 weeks. And I want to make a correction. I made a mistake on my slide. The National Permanency Conference in Nashville is on 10/23 and 10/24, so it's October 23rd and 24th. I really, really hope that you will join us for this conference. I'm really excited about the array of professionals that will be there talking about trauma-informed interventions. ways to help our children by understanding more about their neurological state. And there are going to be a lot of really great speakers there. I will send to you with your certificate a copy of the flyer so that you can register for the Permanency Conference, and I would love to meet you there. I hope that this was helpful for you guys as you walk through your next discipline challenge, which I hope isn't until at least noon tomorrow. I hope that you will think about set and regulate, think about your expectations, show that empathy, just really get down into what's driving your child, and then work on those skills. Our kids can learn, they can heal. It takes time, but they have so much to offer us, and we have so much to offer them. Thanks again, and I hope that you'll join us on our next conference call. Good evening.